It is Friday, November 7th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Arc Raiders episode of LTPS. As always, let's begin with our PS Plus reminder. The November PS Plus Essential Games are now live on PSN. Make sure you claim those. And just a small little PSA here, but for WRC, you might have noticed that game has one of those weird PS Store listings where it's game and then a drop-down menu for game. So there's two categories that just say game, and it doesn't specify the difference between those two listings, but you can add to library either one. So there is one version of the game that's more feature complete, so just be mindful of which one you are claiming. So you might want to double check that if you already did claim that game, but that's what's going on there. And then going into our first news story, we have an update for the PlayStation franchise rewards system. If you remember, Sony launched that, a month ago now at this point, but that was for Ghost of Tsushima initially, where if you earn certain trophies in that game, you then have the exclusive opportunity to give Sony more money by buying merchandise. So the merchandise was tied to trophies you earn on the game, and they did confirm back then that Yotei would be the next game, so that merchandise is now available as well. So you can earn the trophies by April 30th, 2026, and then the items must be purchased by May 31st, again 2026. There's a Platinum Trophy pin, like Tsushima, $25. There's the Gold Trophy t-shirt for $30, and then a Ghost of Yotei jacket, $150. That one is also tied to the Gold Trophy as well, so you don't need a Platinum. But if you want to spend a lot of money on this game and have exclusive merch, then you can go ahead and do that. I still am not baffled, but this just is not really, I think, the direction this should have went. In spirit, it makes sense. Oh, cool, something that you can finally do with trophies, or you have exclusive access to something for earning a platinum, but then it's like, okay, the optics is give us more money. So these still aren't really for me, but this is now available on the Ghost Rewards website. Moving on to one of the bigger news items from this past week, and that is the PlayStation Portal 6.0 firmware update. This one is quite big because really it's offering not just a number of new features, but really one crucial feature in that you can now stream the vast majority of PS5 games if you digitally own them or if they're in the game catalog. That was the stipulation prior with last year's beta, is that you could only stream PS5 games from the game catalog on PS Plus Extra or Premium. Now it's fully open. So the full 6.0 update did redesign the interface very slightly. So there's 3 tabs now, one for standard remote play, and then PS5 game streaming, or you can now search. The search bar function is there to search any game that is streamable, so that's quite handy as well. If you look up a game that is not available to, if you don't own it per se, then you can get a QR code that'll take you to the PS Store listing from the PS mobile app. You can buy it there, then server side, you can start streaming the game again, so that's a nice little handy way to do that, but that's the search bar. And then the section where you can actually look at games, it is indeed going to show you what you own out of your digital library. So the full list, the PS blog did outline this. It's basically all of them. There's 2,800 titles, so it's exclusively PS5 streaming, so that's always the stipulation, and that's what we got into for yesterday's video going over that new firmware, but it's still PS5 server blades. So the PS4 native games, PS3 stuff, those are 2 other separate servers. You still can't stream or touch those games, but if something has a PS5 version, if you've been buying a lot of digital games on PS5, then your portal is going to show you all those games. So there should be a pretty big selection based on whatever you did buy, because it's basically all the PS5 native stuff that you can stream. And then for other features, there's 3D audio support, so you can finally use 3D audio via remote play or streaming. There's the passcode lock, very similar to how you can do that on the console. There's the network status screen, very handy. That will give you a good idea of exactly what your downstream and upstream is. Maybe you're running into some network problems. You can use that via remote play or streaming. Then there's also in-game store support as well, so any game that can offer MTX baked in, not jumping you to the PS Store, you can transact that directly on the portal. There's also streaming accessibility options, so you can just change text size and things like that. And then game invitations work as well, baked into a game. So if you're streaming that particular title and somebody invites you in, you can join in from there on the portal when you're doing PS5 game streaming. So a number of new features. That's the most Portal has ever gotten in a singular firmware update. In fact, PS5 game streaming was down for like a few hours or something on the night that it went out, but now it seems to be back up and working just fine. So that undeniably adds a ton of utility to the portal. And being able to see the millisecond latency for your play sessions with that toggle is just incredibly insightful. The one thing they're still not doing, though, is showing you or giving you any sort of leverage on bitrate, which is really important for remote play sessions. So I think that is like, if anything, I think that's the one last crucial thing the portal needs to be extremely useful, certainly for those that might have problems with the portal. So I would love to see that at some point, but for now, this was a very big, useful update for the portal, and it really is becoming this device that I think for many has been really surprising and out of left field, sure, but something that you can get so much mileage out of. Let's get into some PlayStation Store news. There's been new evidence of dynamic pricing happening on the PlayStation Store, which, if you remember, this popped up last year for Astrobot, for that one particular game where people did notice that they were getting different targeted sales for the game. So some people had no sales for Astrobot, others had the game discounted to $50, $45. It was contingent on that particular user, so it's very targeted dynamic pricing. Well, recently, one Reddit user said they experienced this with pricing for Red Dead Redemption 2, where the price for the Ultimate Edition was $20, and then their wife's account was showing $15, which might be something Sony is deploying more often now. Regionally, this would be the US. You can't do this in Europe as far as I understand it. And it seems like it might only be this game in this one particular situation. I know there was one thread for, it was like the PlayStation India subreddit, and there was another example of that happening as well. There's not like mass reports where everyone's like shouting from the rooftops about how they're spotting all these different pricing situations from different accounts or siblings or spouses. Like, we're not really finding that much evidence, but we're seeing something where it's possible that this could be happening maybe in a very slow rolled out phase, which targeted, pricing discrimination sucks. It's not fun. I mean, it's one of those things where, sure, ideally it'd be great to get a sale for a game when you're the person that's being given the sale, but if a game's already on sale and somebody else gets it for maybe $5, $10 cheaper just based on their own play habits, because ideally that's the thing that Sony would love to do, is be able to sell games for more to people that they know are going to, or they're willing to buy a game for more, versus somebody that's maybe less engaged and they need just a little bit more to push them over the edge to finally close out that transaction. So it's like it can be very predatory, right? So this doesn't bode well. We'll see if it becomes a more common practice, although you'd be surprised how often this stuff does happen outside of PlayStation. I think for a lot of folks it becomes normalized, and that's not exactly fun. In other PlayStation Store news, we have another somewhat small, isolated example, but a rare occasion where Sony might be honoring refunds for a game based on the complaints being thrown at that game. The game in question is the recent release of the Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection, where initially on PlayStation 5, people noticed right away this game has some serious input lag, and there's also some issues with the soundtrack as well, but it became immediately obvious that the game just feels very sluggish, and for a fighter where that response time is crucial, it's just not really a good experience. So over on Reddit, one user did claim that they were able to get a refund from the collection, shared some screenshots with their chat log from PlayStation support. So this might be one of those rare examples, like a Cyberpunk or a Mind's Eye, where if there's enough complaints coming in about one particular game based on it maybe being misleading or not working properly, that PlayStation support has been given the okay to honor refunds for that game. Because typically the store policy is, if you even so much as download a game, you are invalidated from a refund. So this game might be in that weird edge case of it's okay to request a refund for it. The Studio Digital Eclipse has already acknowledged the issues, by the way, both the music and input delays, and there's already been a new patch that's been deployed for the game, but that's only slightly helped the PS5 version, which does appear to be the worst offender for the input latency, where the millisecond timing is down from 108 to like 91, so it's a marginal improvement, but for 90 something milliseconds on a fighter, even if that is how the game felt or played back in the arcade days. I can't speak to that personally, but I mean, that's kind of the thing. Whether it's a remake or a remaster, oftentimes even remasters, you want quality of life fixes to be introduced to what is bringing a game up to a modern audience. So it doesn't, in my view, I think it doesn't really matter if you're going to try and match the original experience as close as possible. That's fine. You can add that in there, but certainly create a toggle to make sure the game's not inherently frustrating for new and returning players. Now, perhaps the most alarming news story from this past week is new evidence of a cross-buy initiative that PlayStation may or may not be doing for what we think is PS5 and PC, because what happened here was this was discovered over on Twitter from the user Amidst, where there was a new cross-buy tag data mined from the PlayStation backend. This was then verified by Bilbokun and others, where you can get the tag to appear on PS5 consoles themselves, and this tag has been added to the PlayStation site as recent as June 2025. Because that's the one element to consider here, is that Sony is no stranger to cross-buy initiatives. They were actually one of the earliest ones to pioneer this in the console space with PS3, PS4, and PS Vita. It was first PS3 and Vita doing cross-buy, cross-save functionality. By the time PlayStation 4 came to the scene, there was a good year or two of developers that were shipping games on all three, and that was up to them as far as where they would allow the license to be granted. They could allow a full cross-buy license, and thus you would be able to own the game on all three platforms buying it one time. So Sony is absolutely no stranger to this space, and this cross-buy tag is indeed very genuine. I mean, tags are a thing on the PS5 UX experience. You can see them for platforms, PS5 and PC more recently. In fact, the most recent new tag would be PlayStation Link and also the Power Saver icon, which showed up for some of the new games that got patched as well. So this platform tag, which is very real, does show some intention that it's something they're maybe planning on doing relatively soon. Certainly given that it showed up on the PSN backend back in June of this year. Now, the real question is, what would this be for? And naturally, I think it would be PS5 and PC. But the issue is they already sell PC games on Steam, so really this might be more evidence of Sony finally getting their own PC launcher, their own storefront available to launch, and that might be the one way to really justify that, because the thing about the PC audience is that it's nearly impossible to get people to buy games outside of Steam. I don't know if this would really move the needle, but it does add a lot of utility, and that, you know, for Sony going back to the cross-buy initiative, it has to make sense for them, and so they do want to recognize revenue fully on PC with their games, and so they could do that with their own storefront, their own launcher, and there might be an extra bonus there for some of the hardcore PlayStation users, or somebody that just wants that extra utility out of the license by saying, hey, I'll go buy it on the launcher instead, and therefore I'll get a PS5 license as well. If they are somebody that, you know, buys and plays on PC and PlayStation 5 at the same time. You would also presume that would have some cross-play in there, or rather cross-save available in there as well, which would be mostly tied to just PlayStation Plus, I would imagine, just pulling the save and updating it that way. So it's a pretty seamless experience on, say, the Portal, for example, with the recent PS5 game streaming. But you got to assume that's maybe where this is going. I mean, that's the running theory that makes the most sense, unless this tag is here very early for initiatives that they're planning on the next cycle of PlayStation systems, which would be PS6 and the PlayStation handheld. Although I don't know if that would need a cross-buy tag necessarily, depending on how those machines are marketed and shown off. So it's like, and that's still 2 years away, right? Like the thing that makes the most sense is probably PS5 and PC, because they wouldn't do this for Steam. So we'll see where this goes. It's a relatively new development, but it is certainly one that's verifiable. So it will be fascinating to see Sony enter into a new era of what is cross-buy, and that's something they have very much done so before. Let's move on to some game news here, beginning with Insomniac Games and Marvel Studios, where we had some words recently from Marvel about their relationship with Insomniac Games. So recently, when speaking with Game Informer, the Marvel Games general manager, Haluk Mendez, was talking about the factors that play into determining their approach for collaborations and new projects. And so they spoke quite highly about Insomniac here, saying, quote, "We actively seek collaborators that want to take on the same mantle. As is usually the case, once we complete the project together, they too become Marvel. Marvel's Wolverine with our dear friends at Insomniac Games is perhaps the epitome of this philosophy. We have been working together for more than a decade and developed such a shorthand across multiple Marvel Spider-Man games that when the time finally came to bring Logan back in spectacular and visceral fashion, it was obvious to everyone on our team that Insomniac was the perfect choice. It was our shared culture and values that brought us together, and we're so proud to continue collaborating for many years to come. Now, this is one of those things that is very easy to speculate on because there's not much speculation that needs to happen. We had the Insomniac breach, we had a roadmap of what the studio is planning on doing, and so while plans do change, at the very minimum, we are very well informed on things beyond not just Spider-Man 3 or this rumored Venom game, but of course Wolverine and, well, other things that are going into 2030. For those that did or did not see the roadmap, the information is out there, obviously. But there is still that understanding that there are plans for what were another Ratchet game. Remains to be seen if that is still on the way, but also a new IP into the 2030s. But I think that breach was very enlightening in a way, or it certainly reinvigorated that conversation of the upset some do have with Insomniac as far as where they are right now, and that's them being a Marvel machine. You know, for a lot of folks, that was pretty upsetting for them to walk away from properties like, well, not necessarily Ratchet, we got a new one this generation, but something like Resistance, right? And so it's going to be a long time until they can explore something new and different. So to have them be this Marvel machine has been quite upsetting for some core Insomniac fans. And I'm somewhere in the middle there because, you know, I always say this when I play the older Spider-Man games during those memory card videos or something. I always frame it as I'm sorry for stomping on somebody's childhood here, but these games just were not good until Insomniac made them. To have such a talented studio finally explore those characters in a way that created fun, engaging gameplay that felt really good, the best that you could possibly feel as your Spider-Man swinging through a city, and then captivating storylines. I feel like they took the franchise and that character to a lot of places that it never really got to go in prior generations. And I think they can do that for Venom. I think they can do that for Wolverine. I think they can do that for Spider-Man 3 and beyond. But it's if they're going to commit to Marvel and be a Marvel machine for 10-something years, then no doubt it's still disappointing on the other end of that to think, man, there's not going to be another Resistance, and we're not going to see a new IP out of them for who knows how long. I'm somewhere in the middle. I can appreciate both angles of it, because it's not like I don't like the Marvel games. If you don't like them, then obviously you're going to swing much more heavy on the pendulum there for wanting them to go back to games like that. But it'll be quite a long time, and this quote really does punch that point across home. Moving on to some PlayStation VR2 announcements, which, yes, PSVR is still getting games, somewhat often, actually, but this time around we had a number of announcements from Flat2VR Studios and Impact Reality, where they're doing very important work because, as their name implies, they're stepping in to facilitate these transitions of 2D games being converted into VR experiences. And so they recently held a live stream on the PSVR Without Parole channel and working in collaboration with the PlayStation blog to announce a number of new games, like VR Racer Hoverbike or Vracer Hoverbike. That game shadow dropped. It's available right now. This is an arcade racer that has some very clear Wipeout inspiration and DNA in there. Looks quite good. Then there's Audio Trip. That game's coming out very soon, November 20th, or the 11th, excuse me. This is a dancing rhythm game where you move and hit the incoming notes. Then RoboQuest VR. That one's coming out on the 20th. That is a roguelite FPS action game. Then there's Shadowgate VR, The Mines of Mythrock, coming November 25th, and that is a mythical first-person adventure game. That game has some deep roots in PlayStation history. And then other further out announcements, we have Rager coming Q1 next year. This is a sort of rhythm game, but it's combined with melee combat against these incoming hordes of robotic enemies. And then there's Out of Sight VR 2026, just a release window. No idea exactly on the quarter that we're expecting this game, but you do play from the perspective of a child's teddy bear, and you're leading her to, or you're leading the child to safety through this big mansion. So always love the play on perspective there with VR in particular. So still a lot of really cool things coming out of the VR space. I recently was playing some VR finally from 30 Platinum's Part 4. Still coming. Editing is taking a while, so just an FYI there. But it's always fun getting back into the headset because I'm always reminded of how much I truly love that space, because those games are they're very different and they feel very different compared to the 2D stuff. So it's always neat having more PSVR2 announcements because the headset does still have software in the pipeline. Next up, we also have a new trailer for another India Hero Project game, Suri the Seventh Note, which shows off more of this game's really interesting side-scrolling platforming that's tied with the beats and rhythm of the game. So that's kind of what they're trying to do here, is that the game is going to make critical use of the DualSense haptic feedback, and that's going to match every beat and sensation of the game based on the platforming segments. I'm actually really hoping that it's like intrinsically tied to the DualSense in a way where it's not just lip service and the game is like really overdoing it, sort of like Astrobot in a way, where that game, almost everything you do in Astrobot like has haptic feedback with it, based on what you're jumping on, what you're walking on, where you're walking through. And I sort of love when games really lean into that, and so I almost feel like for this game to stand out even more than it already does, to really lean into the controller features even more. But it's great seeing more from the India Hero Project, and you always get games that, whether they might feel samey from a gameplay perspective, it's always artistically where they do stand out, right? And that's what I love most about the India Hero Project. So Suri just got a new trailer. The game is still coming sometime next year, I believe. There's no exact date planned for it just yet. All right, moving on to a new ad campaign that Sony launched this past week for PlayStation 5. Every few years, they'll usually do this where there's a new slogan, new commercials. So this time around, it's called It Happens on PS5. And what's different about these is that they're kind of going back to the old way they did commercials, where it's live action and it's really abstract and weird and there's no gameplay. This isn't super weird, but they are kind of funny to see. So one of them is showing off a woman that's in a semi-truck and it got impaled on top of a building, and then it ends with It Happens on PS5. There's one with a fisherman pulling in an unworldly creature from the deep, and then a man cuts himself free from the inside of it. It Happens on PS5. And then another one is these guys trying to hitchhike, but they keep getting ignored because they actually crash landed from this giant alien ship or something in the middle of nowhere. It Happens on PS5. And so that's kind of what they're doing. It's not very traditional. I guess it is, depending on how you frame it. So there are the older, PS1 and PS2 commercials that did that. There's some PS3 ones they did as well. But yeah, it's quirky. I definitely like seeing these sometimes. There is another one as well where it is actual gameplay, but it's using the new tagline. So I'm curious if that's the one they're going to stick with as the generation closes out. But it has also sparked this conversation of it's fascinating seeing Sony refresh the marketing for PS5 in what might seem like a very deliberate way in face of what was previously their closest competitor, because what Microsoft went all in on is the "This is an Xbox" tagline, where every device you have can be an Xbox because you can play an Xbox game on there or something, right? That's sort of where they're going, which is very agnostic. And then on the flip side, when Sony decides to refresh their ad campaign, it feels more deliberate of this happens on PlayStation. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure how purposeful that really was, but it is still very much in line with how Sony has always gone about it, which is traditional console marketing. All right, let's get into some third-party news. This one I was not able to catch last week because I was coming out of 30 Platinums, and it was a whole thing. I was just super tired. So we skipped a lot of news stories last week. But The Outer Worlds 2, which came out very recently on PlayStation 5, the game has been somewhat problematic. It's still playable, but Digital Foundry, when breaking down the game, it seems like the title on PS5 has some frame rate issues on both performance and quality modes, has some screen tearing issues that pop up on occasion, but it's PS5 Pro where the game does use PSSR, and that doesn't seem to match well with the lumen lighting in the game, so that starts to create some visual noise and flickering in the scenes, which is not really a unique PSSR issue. It's been happening very frequently, And so somewhat recently, we had a patch go out for the game that's been deployed, and that does swap out PSSR for a more traditional TSR solution. So that is at least cleared up for now. So that would resolve the image a little bit better when it's trying to reproduce a 4K image quality, since TSR is a little bit more traditional there. But DF was also theorizing that the game was coming in hot based off whatever sort of development timeline that Obsidian was working with, considering it was in that weird aspect of them being acquired and then having to perhaps backpedal on a PlayStation 5 build and then being given the okay to go back to that PS5 build and ship it. So we did see a number of games that were kind of caught up in that whole thing, as we know that full multi-platform approach was a more recent, within the last 2 years, U-turn. So that would make a decent amount of sense. It just sucks that some games have to be a victim of that. But it also does not bode well for, again, PlayStation 5 Pro, which is supposed to be the premium, low-volume, enthusiast console that time and time again, with these high-profile games that come out, and if you're owning a PS5 Pro, you're probably an engaged buyer that's buying and playing a lot of games. It's not uncommon at this point that you're getting the worst version of these games oftentimes, or at the very minimum, running into some PSSR issues. I sincerely hope next year that the range of titles shipping on PlayStation 5 with PSSR will be very clean, stable, and oftentimes producing very good-looking games compared to other competing platforms. Moving on to some AI news, there's been a lot going on in this space as far as how generative AI can be used and deployed in the game creation process. And so 2 weeks ago, we had that report from Business Insider how EA's managers are really pushing for this internally, trying to make creative teams put it into their workflow in some way, shape, or form. And recently, we now had this SEC filing about the deal to take EA private, and the company disclosed how their AI use would change with that deal going through. And they said they'll maintain a steady, thoughtful approach. And they say AI is a tool that will power or empower their people to put creativity first by reimagining workflows. So they are really using lip service there to make it seem as glamorous and pretty as they want it to be, obviously, because AI has a lot of potential upside, but it really does depend on how you use it and how it's put into the workflow. For some people, naturally, they don't really want to use it if it's a very creative field, but that really depends on, again, what exactly the field is and what's being made, right? So that's a good segue to our next news story about Square-Enix, where they recently disclosed how they want to utilize AI for their business. And so they announced this new partnership with the University of Tokyo, where they want to improve the efficiency of game development through AI technology. So this project, this collaboration itself, is named Joint Development of Game QA Automation Technology Using Generative AI. And the goal is to automate 70% of QA and debugging by the end of 2027. Which, that sounds alarming. Here's the thing, right? And I've been pretty vocal about this. AI has a place, Gen AI has a place in game development because, one, it's going to happen, right? It's more a matter of how do we safely navigate that, which is going to be very hard to do when these are a lot of publicly traded companies that would love to get labor costs down, and labor cost is the number one factor for game development. So I have no hope that morally that's where companies will be able to take this, right? That's the concern. But with that in mind, it will happen. It will be deployed. It's going to be normalized very, I don't know if quickly is the right way to say it. I guess in certain sectors it is being normalized, no problem, but I digress. It's just a matter of how do you work with it, right? And in some cases where it can be a very safe extension of human work, you know, there's a lot of potential upside. Creatively, like I have a problem with AI in that sense, right? If it's starting to fully generate certain things that could be more handcrafted by a person and there's personal human touch involved in that process, like that's where I wouldn't really want it to be used. Something that's more monotonous and quite frankly, something human work can't do to the full extent that AI could, that is where you could perhaps on the other side of this have a product that is maybe, I don't want to say completely bug-free, but that's what quality assurance is. I wouldn't want people to lose their jobs, full stop. But, if you have AI being deployed by existing QA team members, that if it does in some way, shape, or form naturally fit into the workflow, and they can monitor the process and make sure that they're utilizing it in a manner where they're covering much more ground than they reasonably could, that is where AI makes a load of sense, because that's what quality assurance is it can be very monotonous, sure, but it's also something where, for open world games in particular, it's very hard to chase bugs and find bugs to begin with. That's partly why when games launch and they seem like this bug-ridden mess, sometimes, it's simply a factor of how many people are now exposed to the game. And so you can only reasonably do so much testing in that private, closed environment until a game then comes out. And let's say 2, 3, 4 million people are playing it at any given time. You're going to get more QA in an hour than you could have ever done in like 2 years. As an example, it's one of those things where AI can work for you. It can work for a lot of us in ways that are just so much more efficient than humans could ever reasonably do. Do I think Square can navigate that safely? Well, my laughter is maybe indicative of how I feel about that. But that's one example where I look at that. I don't immediately shut it down and hate it. I think, okay, that makes sense. How will you do it? And that's where it can be sketchy very quickly. In other labor-adjacent news, and first off game news here, which is Grand Theft Auto 6, unsurprisingly, the game is delayed again, which I say unsurprisingly because Rockstar has a history of this. They do tend to put dates on their games and then keep delaying them, so perhaps this will be the one that they actually stick to, which the game has been moved from May 2026 to November 19th, 2026. So it is a new date that they plan to actually release the game, but for now they do say just, hey, here's a heads up, game's been moved again, we need more time, more polish, things like that. And this is right off the back of a really big controversy going around Rockstar Games, and that there has been some firings, some union busting being alleged, because about 34 staff were recently let go for what Rockstar claimed was them leaking information in a private Discord, but this was a union Discord, and everyone there was a union member, and as far as we're hearing, there was no confidential info being leaked or discussed, just work conditions, crunch, things like that. And so the total number of members was about to hit a threshold to start bargaining with Rockstar. So this is being seen as clear as day union busting by unjustly firing these employees. They've also been picketing outside of the Rockstar headquarters. It's been a whole thing, but that initially happened, and then the delay happens. It would appear as though a lot of senior staff were let go of as well. Not to imply that like those staff were the reason why the game was delayed. I assume that delay was going to be coming in hot no matter what. But it's very ironic in light of the announcement and all this news going on, right? So it's a shame hearing that from Rockstar. Not at all surprising from both angles, obviously, because I think a lot of folks did look at that May date and think, okay, but are you going to hit that too? Are you sure? Are you really sure about that? So for what is a very big game that is going to do well no matter when it releases, it really doesn't have to be the holiday season. It can come out whenever it wants to, and it will sell incredibly well. So with that in mind, it's always a shame to at least see things like this on the labor side of things when it comes to the hardworking people that make these games. In other Rockstar news, we got more insight for Agent for PlayStation 3, which many remember back in 2009, I think it was, where that game was announced as a PlayStation 3 exclusive on the E3 stage, no less. That was a big deal. The game never came out. We had 2 or 3 very big high-profile stories that came out from former staff about the assets and where they went and why the game never really went nowhere. But now we're getting another story from a very big source, which is Rockstar Games co-founder Dan Houser, who is speaking with Lex Friedman on their podcast. And Houser touched on an open-world spy game, which we know is the canceled PS3 exclusive Agent. So he said they went through 5 iterations of that game, and it just didn't really work out. Quote, "I've concluded that what makes them really good as film stories makes them not work as video games. We need to think how to do it in a different way as a video game." He actually said a lot more about the game that we're not going to read all that off verbatim, but really just diving into the sort of separation between the I guess the medium as a static experience and how do you make that more interactive. And he kept coming to the conclusion of it just doesn't really work, which I would suspect that, yes, they went through many iterations to, sort of build that vertical slice and prove that it's a viable product. That's what many game studios do, and eventually deciding to move on and also move on to Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead, obviously. So that's sort of what made the most sense for Rockstar's pipeline down the road. But it's interesting to hear, I guess this pushback of it just didn't work. Now, it's a fascinating interview. You don't hear Dan Houser ever speak about this stuff at all, really. So there's been many headlines from this interview, but at least for this show in particular, that game does stand out, which is Agent. But it's we have Hitman. Hitman seems to make that formula work. It's not exactly the same, but I don't know. It's weird. I think there's still a number of things that maybe they weren't willing to talk about per se, but it was still fascinating nonetheless to hear them talk about Agent again and talk about it in this manner. Moving on to a new study released by Ampere Analysis, which was looking at remasters versus remakes and how consumer spending habits are on those two types of experiences. And what they found is that people spend more money on remakes. So they were looking at 42 games total, 15 remakes and 27 remasters released between January 2024 and September 2025, and global spending for remakes on average is 2.2 times higher than remasters. Which they do obviously point out that for remakes, they tend to be a product that is, it costs more versus remasters. So typically you're spending more for those games, but they do also tend to sell a little bit better as well. That 2.2 times you do have to consider has every factor included into it. So remasters oftentimes can still be $40, $50 for some of these games that end up hitting retail, for example, like the Oblivion remaster, which is so weird because that game still to me feels more like a remake, but that, or also Gears of War as well. So there's some variables at play, but it does still illustrate the demand from not necessarily just consumers, but it's the publishers as well. Think about these remasters and port jobs. I mean, they tend to be labeled more as port jobs, but they're just substantially easier to do. They don't cost nearly as much. And so you might wonder, why don't we see a lot more of those? And we do see a lot of them, but there is heavy demand for publishers to make relatively safe bets, but they still want to make large bets as well. So I think for a lot of them, they come to this conclusion of, well, it's not even so much a sequel. It's not a new IP, which in this environment is very risky. They sort of want to play around with that big marketing spend in dollars that big AAA games can do, but it's safe when you're doing a remake versus a remaster, which that might also be safe on paper, but there's not nearly as much upside there when player engagement is just not quite there compared to a Silent Hill 2 or something, right? There's so much more upside when a lot more time, money, and resources go into rebuilding the game from the ground up. So it sort of has that AAA marquee appeal of what is a new AAA release versus a remaster, which kind of comes and goes a lot of the time. Another interesting study that just came out is from the French accounting firm Greenly, where they were looking at the environmental impact for video games. And unsurprisingly, one of the headlines here is that physical video games have a much larger environmental impact versus digital games. And so they report that for the manufacturing and shipping of physical video games, that's more than 100 times carbon intensive than digital games. So an example would be 1 million discs. That can emit 312 tons of CO2 equivalency, whereas digital, of course, it does have its own CO2 impact with electricity at home and the data center itself that stores everything, but it's just not nearly as much when you do account for everything involved, whether it's sourcing precious earth materials, earth metals, the data centers, the electricity usage, packing and fulfillment, every sort of vertical of all these businesses, as far as how these games get to you in the end, physical is still substantially higher. Which, here's the thing, not even remotely surprising. This is one of those stories, though, that I know for some, and this was evident in the comments of anywhere the story was posted, it's a lot of people being very vocal about how, well, we don't care because that's where the consumer protections are. We actually own the software. this, that, and the fourth. And I always preach all of those things. This is a topic I care about. I'm always very mindful of how, as far as the CO2 impact for physical games go, it's awful. Like, compared to digital games, right? That's maybe the one angle that I've often considered as far as long term. I mean, it's something where when physical games are not really a thing anymore, if they are ever not a thing anymore, I think there is always a market for them, but it lives and dies at the hands of the console manufacturers. So it's really up to them if they want to stop offering it, because I think there is a bottom, and then they sort of feel very boutique like vinyl, and so they can always be a thing, I find. But it's like, if they ever do go away, there's a side of me that's like, okay, well, that's not the worst thing in the world, if only because it's the environmental impact that millions of discs and plastic and everything. There's a way to go about it in a much more friendly, less CO2 impactful way, which could be, going back to boxed games, like actual cardboard boxes and things like that. The disc itself is still like the issue, but you can lower the impact. I don't know, like, for me, that is something I am always like aware of. I know for some, they just do not care even remotely about that, and that's totally fine. I'm always mindful of that part of the conversation, and that undeniably, yes, physical games do have a much bigger CO2 impact, and we're hearing it's 100 times over. Whether it's 50 or 100 times over, I knew it was always much bigger than digital, undeniably. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X. And if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. You can follow the link down below or scan the QR code, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and our Tuesday video was a conversation about that Sony and AMD partnership and how actually it could be quite brilliant if it's going where I think it's going. And then yesterday was the PlayStation Portal 6.0 update, so if you want to see that in more detail, that was uploaded yesterday. And then coming up, we were supposed to have Click R3 this week. I don't know if we're doing it later tonight or not, so I had to push that back a little bit. So just stay tuned either on Twitter or on the Spawncast Network channel, and we'll probably go live around 9 p.m. Eastern Time, whether it's today or maybe if we have to push it next week, we'll see. But it should be relatively soon. And then another upload on Tuesday as per usual. But that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.